Anybody else want to record? Okay. Okay, do you guys have any questions for me? From anything from chapter 8 or outside of chapter 8? Because we finished chapter 8, I believe. Nothing? We're good?
Actually,
I did have one question, or whoever. Colleen, you can go first.
Oh, okay. Let me get the study guide. Okay, so on the study guide, it says the explain changes with exercise 4. It says exercise heart rate, but I'm not sure exactly what that goes under.
Submax. Exercise heart rate is the same as submax heart rate.
And then I also had another question, actually.
Okay.
It says, how does the respiratory system aid in the acid-base balance? You were talking about something with your son running example. Is it that one? No,
that was active recovery.
Okay, so what is this one?
The respiratory system, I think AJ can explain that one. How is the respiratory system involved in pH balance? It's not in your notes. All right, Gwen, you want to try it?
That's it's cleared out by the bicarbonate buffer, right? When you exhale CO2, you're clearing out lactic acid, right?
So yes, so the pH goes down because of the hydrogen from the lactic acid. So when the bicarbonate buffer picks up the hydrogen, it ends up producing carbon dioxide, which you exhale. So that's the respiratory system, right? So the expiration of carbon dioxide is helping you clear the hydrogen from the lactic acid, which balances your pH. Good. Rachel, what was your question?
So my question was, is there vasodilation at the liver because we're taking if we're going through glycogenolysis where we're breaking down the glycogen into glucose, would we have some vasodilation at the liver in that case?
There's probably some, not as much as at the exercising muscle, but yeah, we do need some blood flow to the liver during exercise.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll do a quick review of the last part of chapter 8 before we go into chapter 11. Okay, so Rodolfo, what happens to VO2 submax as exercise intensity increases and why? You got to unmute yourself.
VO2 submax increases because your heart rate, well, your cardiac output increases, which is your heart rate and your stroke volume. And your AVO2 difference submax also increases.
Oh, increasing. Good. Tatiana, why is heart rate increasing?
It's increasing because of the withdrawal of the PNS, the decrease in vagal tone, increase in the SCN, and yeah. If you need more, or what's that? Okay.
Increased sympathetic nervous system activity through the cardiac nerve and epinephrine.
Okay.
Okay. Nicole, what's happening to submax stroke volume? I mean, why is it increasing?
To remember that one. I know it increases. Oh, stroke volume increases because end diastolic volume increases and end systolic volume decreases. So end diastolic volume increases because of venous return. And then end systolic volume decreases because of the left ventricular contractility.
Mm-hmm.
And What's the other one? Is it the distensibility? Is that,
Mhm. And there's one more.
the left ventricular myocardium?
Well, the left ventricular myocardium goes along with the contractility.
Okay.
So the last one was resistance.
Resistance, yeah.
Yeah,
Resistance
so
goes up, increases. Right.
no, if resistance goes up, that would decrease stroke volume.
Okay, so then resistance decreases.
Yeah, to allow you to increase stroke volume. So good. So when you're giving that short version answer for stroke volume, make sure you mention the end diastolic volume and the end systolic volume, whether they're increasing or decreasing. And then you've got to mention the venous return, the distensibility, the contractility, and the resistance, and whether they're increasing or decreasing also.
Okay.
And then connect them to end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. So that whole formula thing.
Okay.
Good. Lizette, why is AVO2 difference submax increasing?
Because when you increase your intensity, that increases your AVO difference, which means there's more like oxygen in the exercise you muscle.
Okay, so the muscle is consuming more oxygen.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Edwin, what happens to VO2 max as intensity increases?
My bad, I was muted. VO2 max stays the same as exercise increases
Good, why?
because it's not affected by exercise, only by training, right?
Yes, can you give me a more detailed answer
Yeah.
using the formula?
Can I pass on the formula one?
Yes. Pam, can you explain why VO2 max is staying the same?
Because, oh, you said based on the formula, right? Well, because it's at its max, so you can't go higher for the heart rate, the stroke volume, and the AVO2 difference.
Yeah, each of those is staying the same. So anything that's going to change VO2 max has to be something within that formula. So if all the things in the formula are staying the same, then VO2 max is going to stay the same. So heart rate max is the same, stroke volume max is the same, cardiac output max is the same, AVO2 difference max is the same, therefore VO2 max is the same. Okay, Alexis, what is the Fick equation?
The Fick equation is VO2 is equal to heart rate times stroke volume times AVO2 difference.
Good. Okay, Armand, what happens to hematocrit as intensity increases and why?
Hematocrit goes down because total blood volume goes down. And that was because of sweating and one more reason, which I actually didn't write down. What was the other reason?
Melanie, can you, Emily, you have your hand up, go ahead.
So as exercise intensity increases, as exercise intensity increases, hematocrit goes up because the plasma levels are dropping, but the red blood count is staying the same, which would equate to a higher hematocrit percentage.
Good. Everybody okay with that?
Wait, but isn't the plasma going down?
Yes. If plasma goes down and red blood cells stay the same, that's an increase in hematocrit.
Oh, did I reverse that?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
So it means the blood's getting thicker.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Roxanne, what happens to RER as intensity increases and why?
So for RER, as intensity increases, respiratory exchange ratio, we're going to consume more oxygen. Okay, I'm walking myself through this because I missed Monday and Tuesday.
Okay.
We're going to put out more carbon dioxide. So essentially that's higher. That's higher. Would that essentially stay the same then?
Not quite, but that's a good guess. Luciano, what happens to RER as intensity increases and why?
It'll increase it'll increase closer to 1, and that'll be a result of your CO2 production by the exercising muscle and the bicarbonate buffer trying to clear it.
Yes, and it's because we're relying more on carbohydrates.
Yeah.
Right? The higher the RER, the more relying on carbohydrates. So as our intensity increases, we shift to our fast twitch fibers, which work anaerobically, so we rely on carbohydrates. That makes the RER increase. Good. Ariel, what is ventilatory threshold and how is it related to lactate threshold?
I didn't get the definition for that, but I believe it's the point where we begin to start breathing heavily as intensity is increasing. And it relates to the lactic threshold. So we hit it right about 50% of our VO2 max.
Okay, did you relate it to the lactate threshold? Oh, so you said we hit it at the same time as lactate threshold because we hit it at 50%?
Yeah.
Okay, can you give me a little more detail about why they're related? Are they only related because it's a coincidence that we hit them both at about 50%?
Well, we also are breathing out CO2, and that's also with the bicarbonate buffer. So the bicarbonate buffer is what's clearing out the CO2, which is the non-metabolic CO2. So that's what's being pushed out when we're exhaling.
Okay, so yes, everything you're saying is true. Your explanation though is missing a little bit of the connection. Like you can explain ventilatory threshold and you can explain lactate threshold, but the connection is not quite right. So the reason we hit lactate threshold and ventilatory threshold at about the same time is because when you're producing a lot of lactic acid, when you hit your lactate threshold, bicarbonate buffer is working and it produces carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide triggers the inspiratory centers in your brain to increase your respiration rate, your ventilation rate. So your breathing rate will increase at the same time your lactic acid levels are increasing. Okay, therefore lactate threshold and ventilatory threshold happen together. Okay, Tatiana, go ahead.
I just want to make sure my definition was right on that. I wrote down for the last lecture, I said ventilatory threshold mirrors the lactate threshold due to the bicarbonate buffer clearing lactic acid because of the release of CO2. Is that right? Or
yes, you should mention that the CO2 triggers the breathing rate to increase.
Okay.
So it's not just the fact that we're expiring CO2, it's that our breathing rate is increasing because of the increase in CO2 levels. Okay, good. Any questions from anything from chapter 8? Okay, so we're moving into chapter 11, which is, it starts out with the responses to endurance training. It'll go into anaerobic training as well, but we're gonna start out with endurance training. So you understand the difference between endurance training and the high intensity training, right? So it's gonna be low to moderate intensity, below your lactate threshold, long duration. Okay, it can be running, it can be swimming, it can be biking, the modality doesn't matter, as long as it's below your lactate threshold, extended duration, and this is training. Okay, so we're not talking about exercise anymore. We were talking about exercise. If you increase the speed on the treadmill, how does your body respond? Now we're talking about if you do this type of training, if you run 5 miles 4 days a week for a year, now we're comparing your trained body to your untrained body. What adaptations have occurred as a result of that endurance training? So when we get to all the submax factors, it's going to be comparing the trained person to the untrained person exercising at the same intensity. So It'll always be a trained person, untrained person, both jogging at 6 miles per hour. How does the trained person's heart rate compare to the untrained person? How does a trained person's stroke volume compare? How does a trained person's cardiac output compare? How does a trained person's VO2 compare? Okay, so when we're drawing the up and down arrows for this, it's not increasing and decreasing like it was for exercise. It's higher or lower because we're comparing the trained person to the untrained person. So we'll either say the trained person is higher than the untrained person, or the trained person is lower than the untrained person, or the trained person is the same. It's not that the trained person is increasing. Does that make sense? When we're talking about exercise intensity, things were increasing as intensity increases. Now we're talking about at the same intensity, comparing the trained person to the untrained person. It's either higher, lower, or the same. Okay, so if you're drawing arrows, make sure you understand that these arrows are different than the arrows we were drawing before. Everybody okay with that? It might make more sense as we get into it. Okay, so starting with resting heart rate. How's a trained person's resting heart rate compared to an untrained person? Higher, lower, or the same? Rachel says lower. Emily says lower. Rodolfo says lower. Shannon says lower. Okay. Emma says lower. Gren says lower. Good. It is lower. Why do you think it's lower? Take a guess.
Is it because it doesn't have to like work as hard to get blood to the rest of the body?
Yes and no. Give me a physiological answer. What controls resting heart rate?
Your PNS system.
Okay, Alexis, can you explain that?
So I would say that your PNS system is more active. So your vagus nerve would be more active. So you'd just have a lower vagal tone.
Exactly, a higher vagal tone.
I mean, yeah, higher like vagal.
So someone who does endurance training has a more active parasympathetic nervous system. More active your parasympathetic nervous system is, the higher your vagal tone, the lower your resting heart rate. Everybody good with that? Okay.
Does that mean that someone that does endurance training like will sleep easier because the parasympathetic is more active?
I'm not sure how directly it relates to sleep. We're specifically talking about heart rate.
Yeah, but heart rate has to go down for that, right? So.
Yeah, but just having a lower resting heart rate doesn't necessarily mean you sleep better.
Oh, all right.
So I'm not sure if there's an actual connection there. Okay, max heart rate. How does a trained person's max heart rate compare to an untrained person? Higher, lower, or the same? You can guess with your fingers, higher, lower, same. I can see you guys. Rachel says the same. Rodolfo says the same. Luciano, same. Emma, same. Edwin, same. Alexa, same. Good. So everybody says max heart rate is the same, and that's true because max heart rate depends on your age, not affected by training. Although you could argue if this person has done a year of training, their heart rate max might have gone down a little bit because they got a little bit older. You could argue that. Okay, but it's not affected by the training. Submax heart rate, I'm going to skip and come back to. AVO2 difference max. How does a trained person's AVO2 difference max compare to an untrained person? I'm going to assume you know what AVO2 difference max is. Emma says higher, Emily says higher, Rachel says lower. Who else is voting? Those are my only guesses. Justin says higher. Alexis says higher. Okay, Alexis, why do you think AVO2 difference max would be higher?
Okay, let me think. So I think that the AVO2 difference would be higher because you'll be more efficient at consuming oxygen when you're exercising. So now your the difference will be a lot larger now because you're able to consume more oxygen in your muscles. Your atrial blood versus your venous blood is there's gonna be just a bigger difference.
Good. Emily, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, it's because there's like more myoglobin, more capillary density, more mitochondria size and number, and more oxidative enzymes due to the endurance training.
Good. So when we talk about changes in your body due to training, now we've got to talk about what are the specific adaptations that cause the AVO2 difference to increase. So remember that AVO2 difference is the difference between the oxygen content in the artery and in the vein. So the more oxygen the muscle takes in, the bigger the AVO2 difference. Okay, and we're talking about AVO2 difference max. So this is the muscle's maximum capacity to consume oxygen. Okay, so if you do endurance training, where you talked about what happens with your mitochondria, you're gonna get more mitochondria, and the mitochondria you have are gonna get bigger. So you have more spaces where we can consume oxygen. Okay, we're gonna get more capillaries. We're gonna get more myoglobin, and we're gonna get more enzymes. These are Rachel's 5 sisters. Remember that all these things connect together. If we just grew our mitochondria, it wouldn't increase our capacity to consume oxygen. Okay, we have to also have the capillaries to deliver it and the myoglobin to uptake and deliver it, and the oxygen and the oxidative enzymes to take us through the processes. Okay, so we get those 4 adaptations when we do chronic endurance training. There are more adaptations I'm going to add to it later. But while we're here, who should I call on? Nick, can you name the oxidative enzymes?
I believe it's citrate synthase.
Mm-hmm.
Spacing on the last 2. Oh, cytochrome oxidase.
Cytochrome oxidase.
Missing that last one from the Krebs cycle.
There's 2 more.
I mean, yeah, 2 more. Sorry.
Justin, do you want to finish?
I know another one is succinate dehydrogenase.
Mm-hmm. The one we're missing is the rate limiting one for Krebs.
I know.
Melanie, do you remember what it is?
What were the ones that we already named?
Isocitrate.
Iso something. I just remember that part.
Citrate
Isocitrate dehydrogenase. Okay, so the oxidative enzymes is no longer a vague term. Okay, the oxidative enzymes are referring to the enzymes in the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, and you should be able to name those and connect those here. Okay, you get more of those enzymes, which help your Krebs cycle and your electron transport chain work more efficiently, which is going to increase our maximum capacity to consume oxygen in the muscle. Okay, so you've got to start connecting this stuff. AVO2 difference submax. So now we're at a submax. So we have the trained person and the untrained person both jogging at 6 miles per hour. How does the trained person's AVO2 submax compare to the untrained person's AVO2 submax? Is it higher, lower, or the same? Gwen says higher. Rachel says higher. Pauline says higher. Justin says the same.
Stays the same.
Caesar says the same. Emily says the same. So some people are saying higher and some people are saying the same. So one of you who said it's higher, can you explain to me why it's higher? I don't remember who said that.
Well, like we said, they have more of those energy system characteristics, so they're going to use those during the exercise to get more oxygen, right?
Okay, and someone who thinks it's the same, can you explain why you think it's the same? I didn't make note of who said what.
I'd say stay the same because I feel like for a trained person, it will be easier since they have a higher VO2 max.
Okay, so would that make it go down then, or would that make it stay the same?
Stay the same? No.
Emily, what do you think? Emily, what do you think?
Are we on the, sorry, my computer logged out. Are we on the same question?
AVO2 difference submax. How does the trained person's AVO2 difference submax compare to the untrained person? They're both jogging at 6 miles per hour.
I think it would be the same because they're consuming the same amount of oxygen regardless of like the differences between them.
Okay, so you guys have heard an argument for higher and an argument for same. Anybody want to argue for lower?
I'm changing my answer to same because they're at the same pace, right? So
they're both jogging at 6 miles per hour.
Yeah, so their muscles are both consuming the same amount of oxygen if they're at the same pace, right? So I'm gonna stick with same.
Okay, anyone else want to add anything? Should we take another vote?
But also, wouldn't it be easier for the trained individual to run this pace rather than the untrained?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's that going to do to their AVO2 difference?
Oh, it's going to increase it, right?
That's what we're trying to figure out. So Emily's changed her vote to increase. Emily's not sure. Emily can argue either side. Shannon, what do you think?
I would think that it would stay the same because I don't know. They are breathing the same amount of air and they're running. I don't know. I don't know.
Andrew, you have your hand up.
I think AVO2 submax might decrease because the AVO2 difference is basically how much the muscle is consuming the oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
So if a trained person has more energy system characteristics, then they're more efficient at delivering the oxygen. So
they need less.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's so the question I asked is, trained person and untrained person, both jogging at 6 miles per hour, how does the trained person's AVO2 difference submax compare to the untrained person? So if you think about what AVO2 difference is, it basically means how much oxygen the muscle is consuming, right? Because the more oxygen the muscle consumes, the higher the AVO2 difference will be. So basically what the question is asking is, at 6 miles per hour, is the trained person consuming more oxygen, the same oxygen, or less oxygen than the untrained person? We've already established that they have a higher max. At the same submax, will they consume more, less, or the same? At this point in the semester, I'm no longer giving you the answers because you have the knowledge to figure it out. So what do you think now? Show me with fingers, up, down, or the same. Pamela says lower. Rodolfo says lower. Roxanne says higher. Edwin says lower. Alexis says the same. Shannon says the same. Rachel says lower. Evelyn says lower. So I'm getting a lot of lowers now. Okay, so to get us off this topic, move us forward a little bit. Let me ask you this. If they're jogging at 6 miles per hour, can we calculate the oxygen requirement for that? There's a formula for that, right? Plug in 6 miles per hour, 0% grade, calculate VO2 in mLs per kg per minute. Is fitness in there anywhere? Does your fitness level affect the oxygen cost of a 6 mile per hour run? It does not. Any given intensity has a given oxygen requirement. Relative, mLs per kg per minute. We can calculate what the oxygen requirement is for a 6 mile per hour run. It's the same oxygen requirement for the trained person and the untrained person. It feels easier to the trained person because the trained person has a higher max, which we haven't gotten to yet, the VO2 max. But yes, the trained person has a higher maximum capacity to consume oxygen at the muscle, but you're not consuming your max. You're not going to consume your max all the time. You're only going to consume the oxygen that's needed for the given activity. So just because you can consume 20 milliliters of oxygen, if the work you're doing only requires 5, you're not going to consume 20. You're going to consume 5. Okay? The muscle is only going to consume what's required for the given activity. So if the activity is the same, the intensity is the same, 6 miles per hour on flat grade is the same intensity. Okay? The relative oxygen consumption is the same. The AVO2 difference is the same. Okay? If we were to look at absolute oxygen consumption, we're not talking about VO2, though, we're talking about AVO2 difference. When we get to VO2, we can go into a little bit more detail. But the muscle, the trained person's muscle has a higher maximum capacity to consume oxygen. That does not mean they will consume more oxygen at 6 miles per hour. It does not mean they will consume less oxygen at 6 miles per hour. We can calculate the oxygen requirement. Okay, so understanding that formula and how to use it and why to use it is important in understanding these concepts. Everybody okay with that? Okay. So AVO2 difference submax is the same in the trained person and the untrained person because any given intensity has a given oxygen requirement, regardless of fitness level. Okay, stroke volume max. How does the trained person's stroke volume max compare to the untrained person's stroke volume max? Take a guess. Rachel says higher.
It'd be higher.
Caesar says higher. Gwen says higher. Emily says higher. All right. Roxanne says the same. Armand higher. Justin higher. Okay. It's going to be higher. Let's talk about why. Stroke volume max is one of the major adaptations to endurance training. Stroke volume max depends on what?
EDV.
End diastolic volume max.
And end systolic volume.
End systolic volume max. Okay, at this point, I have to assume that you know what those mean. Okay, so in order to get an increase in stroke volume max, we're going to have an increase in the amount of blood we're putting in there and a decrease in the amount of blood that's left in there. End diastolic volume max depends on 2 things, and systolic volume max depends on 2 things. The things that affect your stroke volume max due to chronic endurance training are different than the things that affect your stroke volume submax during exercise. Okay, stroke volume submax during exercise was not affected, right? It was a max value. Stroke volume submax, we went into a lot of detail about what's causing the increases in end diastolic volume. Remember, it was venous return, distensibility, contractility, and resistance. Those things are all happening as you increase your exercise intensity. Releasing epinephrine, acting on the left ventricular myocardium, increasing contractility. Okay, those things are not a result of chronic training. Those are things that respond to increase in intensity. Okay, so what goes here is going to be different. So we can increase the amount of blood we get into the heart. So we were using the analogy before of the water balloon. So when you do chronic endurance training, it's like trading that water balloon for a bigger water balloon. Your heart gets bigger. The bigger the heart is, especially that left ventricle gets bigger. The bigger the heart is, the bigger that chamber is, the more blood we can fit into it. Okay? We call that left ventricular internal diameter. And it's going to increase. We're going to increase left ventricular internal diameter. Oops, I spelled internal wrong. Sorry. Cross that R out. Okay, let me try that. You guys know how to spell internal, right? Can you survive the fact that I misspelled it? Okay, so an increase in left ventricular internal diameter means the actual chamber is larger. Therefore, we can fit more blood into it, which is an increase in end diastolic volume. Therefore, we can even get more blood out of it, which is an increase in stroke volume. Okay. Distensibility does not change with training. But there are a few other things that allow us to increase our end diastolic volume, and that is increased plasma volume, which we haven't gotten yet on our table, but endurance training causes an increase in plasma volume and an increase in red blood cell count. Those two things together will cause an increase in total blood volume. Okay, the more blood you have in your body, the more blood you can get into your heart. That's end diastolic volume. The more blood you have in your heart, more blood you get out. Okay, let me just add on here real quick. In 446, they will refer to the end diastolic volume as preload. This is what we're filling the heart with before we empty it. Filling the left ventricle with before we empty it. So they'll refer to that as preload. Okay, so you do endurance training, the left ventricle itself, the chamber, gets bigger. It's like taking a bigger balloon, you have more space now to fit blood. That's going to increase your end diastolic volume. You also will increase your plasma volume, increase your red blood cell count, which together will increase your total blood volume, which will also increase your end diastolic volume. Okay, stop me if you have a question. I'm going to move this over. I can't move the end systolic volume over, but these two things are supposed to be coming from the end systolic volume, okay? From there. Okay, so for exercise, we talked about epinephrine acting on the left ventricular myocardium to increase contractility, okay? There's also going to be increase in contractility here, but it's not from epinephrine. It's from hypertrophy. So you can put increased contractility here if you want. That's also happening. I'm going to put left ventricular hypertrophy. So the heart muscle responds to endurance training by hypertrophy. So usually when a muscle hypertrophies, it's going to be able to produce more force. And we'll get more into detail on that when we get into the resistance training chapter. But because this is the left ventricular myocardium now, this is the actual muscular wall, is going to get thicker and it's going to be able to produce more force, which is an increase in contractility or contraction strength. That's going to increase the amount of blood you can get out of the ventricle, which is an increase in stroke volume. Less blood is left in, so it's a decrease in end systolic volume. Okay. Also affecting how much blood is left in the heart is resistance. So this is going to be an increase in hypertrophy. This is going to be a decrease in resistance, would allow us to get more blood out and have less blood left in. Okay, and this is also due to your body gets more efficient at arterial autoregulation. Okay, endurance training, chronic endurance training makes your body more efficient at did I really put an extra E in there? Oh my goodness. This is bad. That E does not belong there. Arterial. Chronic endurance training makes your body more efficient at arterial autoregulation, which makes you better at delivering blood to the muscle. Okay, but that decrease in resistance makes it easier to get blood out, increase in stroke volume, decrease in end systolic volume. Okay. Oh, I've got questions coming up. Let's see. As a result, would there be increased diastolic filling time? In order for there to be increased diastolic filling time, heart rate would have to be decreasing, which we're going to get to. Okay. So you have this formula for stroke volume. Okay, so what's affecting your stroke volume during exercise is different than what's affecting your stroke volume as a result of training. So if you think about it, hypertrophy is not going to be involved in responses to exercise. Okay, hypertrophy is a response to, is an adaptation to training. An increase in left ventricular diameter, plasma, red blood cells, those things don't happen with an increase in intensity of exercise. Those things happen as a response to training. Okay, the release of epinephrine, the venous return mechanisms like the skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump, those things happen as you increase your exercise intensity. Okay, so if you try to memorize these things, again, you can memorize them, but if you understand them, it's gonna make your life a lot easier. Okay, if you try to memorize epinephrine goes with submax stroke volume during exercise, hypertrophy goes with stroke volume max as a result of training, you're trying to memorize that, it's gonna be a lot because I'm not done giving you information yet, right? It's not just this. So if you understand that epinephrine release is a response to exercise, hypertrophy is an adaptation to training, it's gonna help you put these things together, okay? So this should also help you understand the difference between exercise and training as we're using those terms. Yes, one causes chronic adaptations, one causes acute responses. Okay, any questions on stroke volume max in response to endurance training? Pauline, go ahead.
Can you say what's happening with the increase in the left ventricular hypertrophy again?
Yes, so hypertrophy means an increase in size of the muscle, right? Usually that makes for more contractile strength. We'll get in more detail on that in the next chapter. But so the thicker the muscle is, generally the stronger it is, so it can produce more force. So if it can produce more force, we get more blood out, which is an increase in stroke volume. We have less blood left in, which is a decrease in end systolic volume. Okay, but so it's still an increase in contractility, but the increase in contractility is due to hypertrophy and not due to epinephrine. Everybody okay with that? Okay. Submax stroke volume. Okay, so if we're at submax, now we've got the trained person and the untrained person, both jogging at 6 miles per hour. How does the trained person's stroke volume compare to the untrained person? Higher, lower, or the same? Rachel says the same. Pam says the same. Anybody else have a guess? Alexis says higher. Emily says higher. Justin says higher. Okay, Rachel, why do you think it's the same?
Well, I was thinking because oh, never mind. I'm gonna change my answer. I think it increases because we have increased end diastolic volume. So as a result, we would have increased plasma volume. So even when we're exercising, so maximally those things would still be occurring. Yeah.
Yeah, careful with your as a result of, because the increase in plasma is not a result of the increase in end diastolic volume. It's the other way around.
Oh, okay, got you. Thank you.
Anybody else want to chime in here? How does the trained person's submax stroke volume compare to the untrained person at the same intensity? Okay, I'll tell you this one.
Does it have to do with the actual like strength and like size that the heart's like adapted to because of the increased training?
Yes, so these adaptations that we got from endurance training that increased our stroke volume max are there even when you're resting and even when you're at submax, right? Your ventricle is bigger, your ventricle is stronger, you have more blood volume at rest and at submax when you're a trained person. Okay, so your submax stroke volume is going to be higher because of all these adaptations. You're able to get more blood out of your heart with every contraction, resting, max, submax. I'll give you more information on that in a second as we get to cardiac output.
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Yes, your stroke volume submax, a trained person's stroke volume submax will be higher than an untrained person because of all these same adaptations. The increased left ventricular internal diameter, increased plasma, increased red blood cells, increased left ventricular hypertrophy, and decreased resistance. Same adaptations will cause an increase in submax stroke volume. Let's look at cardiac output max. Before I write out the formula, what do you think happens to cardiac output max? Rachel says increase. Emily says increase. Okay, let's look at the formula. Cardiac output max equals stroke volume, heart rate max times stroke volume max. Okay, what happens to heart rate max as a result of endurance training?
Stays the same.
Yeah, say them out loud now because I can't really see you guys anymore. I've got my whiteboard up. So heart rate max is not affected. What happens to stroke volume max?
It increases.
It increases due to increased left ventricular internal diameter, increased plasma, increased red blood cells, left ventricular hypertrophy, and increased arterial autoregulation. The increase in cardiac output max is due to increases in stroke volume max. Everybody okay with that?
Would it also be due to an increase of VO2?
Is cardiac output affected by VO2?
Technically not. That would be
cardiac output is affected by heart rate and stroke volume. Cardiac output is going to affect VO2, but it's not affected by VO2.
Gotcha.
Only affected by the things in its formula. Okay, so now here's an important one. Cardiac output submax. So trained person, untrained person, both jogging at 6 miles per hour. How does the trained person's cardiac output compare to the untrained person? Higher, lower, or the same? Gwen says higher. Gwen, why do you think it's higher?
Well, because the heart is stronger, it can pump more blood per minute.
Okay.
Is this for submax?
This is submax.
I think it stays the same.
Why?
Because it has to do with the oxygen consumption again. Because it's like the fitness doesn't equate to how much oxygen is being consumed at that intensity.
Right, they both need to consume the same amount of oxygen, right? The AVO2 difference we said is going to be the same. So that means they need to deliver the same amount of oxygen. So cardiac output submax equals heart rate submax, which we haven't gone over yet, times stroke volume submax. What do we say happens to stroke volume submax? I can't see you guys if you could say it out loud.
Increases.
Increases, and we gave the 5 reasons. Right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 reasons. Okay, so cardiac output is going to be the same, trained person, untrained person, because they're working at the same intensity, They're consuming the same relative amount of oxygen, so they're delivering the same relative amount of oxygen. Okay, that allows the trained person's heart rate to be lower because the stroke volume is higher and they're delivering the same amount of oxygen. They can do it with a lower heart rate. So this is a more effective system. So if we're delivering the same amount of oxygen, the untrained person can only pump a little bit of blood with each contraction, so it has to contract quickly. The trained person can pump more blood out with each contraction, so it can contract more slowly. So they can deliver the same amount of blood, but the trained person's heart is much more efficient. Okay, so the trained person can deliver the same cardiac output with a higher stroke volume and a lower heart rate. Okay, so you go back to the submax heart rate box. Say the submax heart rate, trained person and untrained person, both jogging at 6 miles per hour, the trained person is going to have a lower heart rate because they have a higher stroke volume. So they can deliver the same cardiac output with fewer beats per minute. Okay, so the submax heart rate is not lower because of the PNS system. The resting heart rate is lower because of the increased parasympathetic activity. The submax heart rate is lower. We can assume we're above 100 beats per minute here. Submax is lower because the stroke volume is higher.
Can you repeat that?
Yes, I can try. So if the trained person and untrained person are both jogging at 6 miles per hour, the trained person, so they both need the same amount of oxygen. So the cardiac output needs to be the same. They're consuming the same amount of oxygen. The trained person will do it with a higher stroke volume and therefore a lower heart rate because they can pump more blood out with each contraction. They don't have to contract as many times to deliver the same amount of blood flow. Okay, so the submax heart rate is lower because the stroke volume is higher. They can deliver the same cardiac output with a lower heart rate. That does not apply as much to the resting heart rate. The resting heart rate is lower because of the increased parasympathetic activity. But that increase in parasympathetic activity does not affect your submax heart rate. Your submax heart rate, in most cases, is going to be above 100. So it's not going to be affected by increased parasympathetic activity. So the lower resting heart rate and the lower submax heart rate are for two different reasons. Okay, so we finished the first side of that table. Let's look it over. Let's do VO2 submax first. Let's just think about it logically. VO2 submax. Trained person and untrained person, both jogging at 6 miles per hour. How does the trained person's VO2, their oxygen consumption, compare to the untrained person? Higher, lower, or the same? Rachel says higher, Pauline says same. Rachel, why do you think it's higher?
I might be thinking of max and realizing that.
Yeah, I'm asking about submax. Can you stop, please?
With submax, probably would be, I was thinking it was higher because they can work more efficiently with oxygen, but if they're running at the same speed, they're still having to consume the same amount of volume of oxygen per, as according to relative. So probably the same. I'm changing my answer.
Okay. Anybody else want to add something?
Well, I think.
Go ahead, Pam.
Okay, because the heart rate, I mean, if you go back to Fick's equation, the heart rate goes down. The only thing that's going up is the stroke volume, and then the AVO2 difference is the same for the submax.
Yeah, we're going to go to the formula, but I wanted you to use your logic first because you should be able to figure this out logically. So Pamela, you're right. But logically, how does a trained person's oxygen consumption compare to the untrained person if they're both jogging at 6 miles per hour?
Yeah, stays the same.
Could we calculate what that oxygen consumption is? We could. We could plug 6 miles per hour, 0% grade into our equation and calculate what the oxygen requirement is. It does not depend on your fitness. Jogging at 6 miles per hour has a given oxygen requirement, relative.
So is there a sort of a trend between these submaxes because they are taking into consideration the fitness and intensity? Okay.
Yes, so the fact that oxygen consumption is the same at any given intensity for a trained person and an untrained person, that means the VO2 is going to be the same and the cardiac output is going to be the same and the AVO2 difference are all going to be the same submax. Stroke volume is the one that won't be. And heart rate won't be because those two adjust to keep the cardiac output the same. Okay? Any given intensity, you've got to wrap your brain around this concept. Any given intensity has a given oxygen requirement in mLs per kg per minute. Okay, so a heavier person is going to consume more total absolute oxygen. But in relative terms, per kilogram of body weight, it's the same. Okay, so think about it this way. If I gave each of you, let's say I gave each of you 5 M&Ms per kilogram of body weight. I'm giving you the same relative amount of M&Ms. The heavier people will get more absolute M&Ms. But in relative terms, I'm giving you the same M&Ms. Does that make sense? So relatively, 6 miles per hour has the same oxygen requirement per kilogram of body weight. But the heavier people are going to consume more total oxygen because they have more kilograms. Make sense? Okay, so now let's look at the formula. This one. What's the formula for VO2?
Cardiac output times AVO2 difference.
Yes, I always use the expanded formula here.
So heart rate times stroke volume.
Yes, we're doing max, so let me add max in here. VO2 max is going to equal heart rate max times stroke volume max. Oh wait, sorry, we're doing submax. We haven't gotten to max yet. My bad. Submax equals heart rate submax times stroke volume submax times AVO2 difference submax. These two together make up cardiac output submax. Okay, what happens to heart rate submax? A trained person versus an untrained person. How does a trained person's heart rate compare to the untrained person?
Lower.
It's lower. How does a trained person's stroke volume compare?
It would be higher.
It's higher. How does their cardiac output submax compare?
Stays the same.
Stays the same because stroke volume is higher and heart rate is lower. AVO2 difference submax, trained person versus untrained person.
Stays the same.
Same. So VO2 is the same, VO2 submax is the same because cardiac output is the same and AVO2 difference is the same. Okay. Perfect. Okay, let's look at VO2 max. Before we look at the formula, let's use logic. What happens to VO2 max as a result of endurance training?
Increase.
Rachel says it goes up. Yes, this is one of the reasons we do endurance training. This is one of our major adaptations to endurance training is an increase in VO2 max. Okay, let's look at why. Let's write the formula. VO2 max equals heart rate max times stroke volume max times AVO2 difference max. Okay. What happens to heart rate max as a result of endurance training?
Stays the same.
Good, it's not affected. Cardiac output. Heart rate max, not affected. What happens to stroke volume max in a trained person?
Increases.
Increases. Why?
Because of the five things that we talked about regarding.
Yep, tell me what they are.
So with the end diastolic volume max, we would have increased left ventricular internal diameter, increased plasma volume, increased red blood cells, and increased total blood volume.
Okay, so I want to list primary adaptations. Total blood volume is a secondary adaptation as a result of the increased plasma and red blood cells. So there's one more primary one.
Increase arterial autoregulation.
Arterial autoregulation, and there's one more.
Oh, hypertrophy of the left ventricle.
Hypertrophy and arterial autoregulation. Okay, these are our 5 primary adaptations that cause the increase in stroke volume submax. These 2 together will also cause an increase in total blood volume, but that's secondary. Okay, right now I'm mainly concerned with the 5 primary ones. So what's happening to cardiac output max in a trained person?
It's higher.
It's higher because the stroke volume is higher. Okay, AVO2 difference max in a trained person?
Higher.
Higher. Why? Primary adaptations.
Increase mitochondria.
Or 4 sisters.
This is mitochondria number and size. What else?
Myoglobin.
Denser capillaries.
Capillary density. Recruitment. Okay.
O2 enzymes.
Yes, so all of these things, by the way, should be increased. Increased internal diameter, increased plasma volume, increased red blood cells, increased hypertrophy, increased arterial autoregulation, increased mitochondria number and size. So the ones you have get bigger and you grow new ones. Increased myoglobin, increased capillary density, increased oxidative enzymes. I'm going to add on here the increase in plasma volume will also increase AVO2 difference. And the increased red blood cell count will also increase AVO2 difference. And the increase in arterial autoregulation will also increase AVO2 difference. So, VO2 max in a trained person is higher because cardiac output max is higher, mainly due to, well, completely due to increases in stroke volume max, and AVO2 difference max is higher, and you should be able to explain those increases in detail. How many unique adaptations do we have here for endurance training that increase VO2 max?
9 of them.
What are they?
So it's the increase in plasma, left ventricular hypertrophy, arterial autoregulation, capillary density, O2 enzymes,
Which you should be able to list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You said there were 9.
Mitochondria number and size. Red blood cells.
Myoglobin.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's missing.
The left ventricular, that one.
Internal
diameter.
Okay. So I just gave you 9 adaptations, 9 unique primary adaptations that contribute to the increases in VO2 max. Some of them contribute to an increase in AVO2 difference max. Some of them contribute to increases in stroke volume max, and some of them contribute to both. You need to know, you need to be able to list these first of all. You need to know which ones contribute to AVO2 difference max and which one contributes to stroke volume max. And we're going to explain each one. How does arterial autoregulation contribute to AVO2 difference max? How does plasma contribute to AVO2 difference max? Let me show you something.
Ventricular hypertrophy is on there twice. Is it supposed to be the diameter?
It shouldn't be. Yes, it should be diameter. Thank you. Erase the whole thing. But basically, yes, thank you for catching that. So how many are under AVO2 difference?
7.
7. The only ones under stroke volume that are not also under AVO2 difference are the internal diameter and the left ventricular hypertrophy, because those are specifically at the heart. Okay, so all 7 of these go under AVO2 difference. Left ventricular internal diameter and left ventricular hypertrophy only go under stroke volume. Plasma's in both, red blood cells are in both, arterial autoregulation are in both. So what that means is we could do this. How many different branches do we have from endurance training? And I spelled training wrong. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 adaptations to endurance training. They will all lead to increased VO2 max. Some of them will go through an increase in AVO2 difference. Some of them will go through an increase in stroke volume and cardiac output. Okay, we're not going to draw this map. It is possible to draw this map. This map does exist. But when I use those concept maps, it's to make your life easier, to help you organize the details. I think when it gets this big, it becomes more of an issue of stress trying to memorize the map and less of a helpful tool to organize. So I'm not going to ask you to draw the map in the sense that everything you need to work on the overlapping. Okay, what you should be able to do is draw each leg individually. For example, increased left ventricular hypertrophy. How does that cause an increase in VO2 max? Think about it. First of all, is this going to go through stroke volume or is it going to go through AVO2 difference?
Stroke volume.
Okay, so how is left ventricular hypertrophy increasing our stroke volume?
It forces more blood out.
Cardiac output. Yeah.
causes a decrease in max end systolic volume, which causes an increase in max stroke volume, then causing an increase in max cardiac output, causing an increase in VO2 max.
Okay, yes. So the first person who said something, I'm not sure who it was, said something about cardiac output. So the cardiac output comes after the stroke volume. Okay, so what the hypertrophy does for you is it gives you more contractile strength, right? It's an increase in left ventricular contractility. That gives you an increased stroke volume max, which would give you an increased cardiac output max, which would give you increased VO2 max.
Do we also include a decrease in the end systolic volume, or that's not necessary?
You could, if you could put that, you could put that here, or you could put that here. I don't need it on this map, but you could certainly put it on there. Yeah. So there, if we look at the list of adaptations, there are 5 adaptations that are going to connect here to stroke volume. I don't need you to draw a map that connects them all. I need you to be able to draw each leg individually. So that just means I need you to be able to explain how each adaptation contributes to an increase in VO2 max. Give me another one. I don't care which one. Just give me one for AVO2 difference.
Capillary density.
Okay, is that going to contribute to AVO2 difference or stroke volume or both?
AVO2 difference.
Okay, so let's think about this. Capillary density means we're going to have more capillaries. How is that going to contribute to AVO2 difference? So the other thing I need to add on here to give you the language to do this. So the cardiac output is considered delivery, oxygen delivery. Okay, bringing the oxygen to the muscle, releasing it there. AVO2 difference is considered uptake and consumption. Uptake is what the myoglobin's doing. Consumption, consumption is what the mitochondria is doing. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Okay, so delivery is bringing of the oxygen to the muscle, releasing it there. Uptake is the myoglobin picking up the oxygen, delivering it to the mitochondria. The electron transport chain in the mitochondria is doing the consumption of oxygen. Okay, so AVO2 difference refers to the uptake and consumption of oxygen. Okay, before you can have consumption, you have to have uptake. Before you can have uptake, you have to have delivery. Okay, capillary density catches this process here at the delivery. That increase in delivery of oxygen is going to cause an increase in uptake, which is going to cause an increase in consumption. If you have an increase in oxygen consumption, that's an increase in AVO2 difference, right? That's what AVO difference is. Let me say that again. If you have an increase in oxygen delivery, and you have an increase in uptake, then you have an increase in consumption. That increase in consumption is the increase in AVO2 difference. So how does an increase in capillary density cause an increase in AVO2 difference? Delivery, uptake, or consumption? Which one comes first?
Delivery.
Good. So do you agree that the more capillaries we have, the more oxygen we can deliver to the muscle?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. There's one more thing I want to add here. I know we're out of time, but do you remember how having more capillaries affects the rate of diffusion?
Yeah.
Is there a law that goes with that?
Yeah, it increases the surface area.
And
Higgs law.
It would be Higgs law.
Yeah.
So that's going to increase oxygen delivery. The more you deliver, the more you uptake. The more you uptake, the more you consume. The more you consume, the higher your AVO2 difference. Okay, so when you do endurance training, you grow more capillaries. That increases your surface area, which increases, so I need to put in here, increased rate of diffusion. Higgs law. Sorry, the increase in rate of diffusion is Higgs law, not the increase in surface area. So that would cause an increase in rate of diffusion, which is going to increase the delivery, uptake, and consumption of oxygen. That is an increase in AVO2 difference, which causes an increase in VO2 max. Okay, so today is Wednesday. Your job between now and Monday is to attempt to write all of the other pathways. You do not need to connect them. Do them separately. The thing is, the ones that are in both AVO2 difference and stroke volume, you have to write separate pathways, one that leads to AVO2 difference and one that leads to stroke volume. So that's plasma is in both, red blood cells are in both, and arterial autoregulation is in both. Okay, so you should come to class on Monday with a bunch of maps drawn, a bunch of individual maps drawn, explaining how each of the 9 adaptations to endurance training causes increases in VO2 max. You guys can work together on those if you'd like. I just want you to put some thought into it. Okay, would VO2 max increase also because of increased tidal volume and respiratory rate? It's not directly affecting it. Okay, because that's not going to affect how much oxygen you're delivering. Breathing faster is not going to give your muscles more oxygen. It's going to blow off carbon dioxide. Okay. Okay, so I have meetings right now during my office hours with people going over their exams. I lost my list, so I hope that you guys know when you're coming in. So I got to do that right now. So that means I'm not having regular office hours because I'm just meeting with people to go over exams. Okay, and same thing on Thursday. I'm going to be going over people's exams. So you can email me with questions. Otherwise, keep in contact with your PLFs and work on these pathways. Luciano, I'm not sure if I think I do have space, but I can't find my schedule. So I'm not sure what time. So you can check in with me, and here I am. Wednesday exam review. I have time at 11:10, 11:20, and 11:50 if anybody wants to take those slots. 11:10, 11:20, and 11:50 I have openings. Alexis, 11:10. Luciano, can you take the 11:20? Okay. And 11:50. 11:50 is going to Pam. Somebody else. AJ, were you raising your hand to get a time slot?
Yeah.
Okay, if you want to come